Thank you very much for coming to the webinar, Reflections on Research, Race with Children. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. So while we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. And you can see a link here on your screen where we invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside. Today's webinar will be moderated by myself, Madison Moore from Trent University, Dr. Noah Keneally from MacEwan University, as well as Dr. Rebecca Raby from Brock University. And it is brought to you today from the Sociology of Childhood and Youth Research Cluster from the Canadian Sociological Association. As you engage in the conversation today, we want to remind you of a few things you can access via Zoom. So Zoom-generated closed captioning is available for accessibility as a live transcript. As you have questions, please use the chat box to submit those questions, and we will be reading them out as we go into the Q&A. We will be addressing questions after the initial discussion, and you can scroll your cursor towards the bottom of the screen to utilize any of these functions in the toolbar. We would like to welcome today's speaker, who is Dr. Rachel Berman from Toronto Metropolitan University. Rachel Berman is an immigrant and white settler who grew up in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is covered under Treaty 13. Rachel is a professor and the graduate program director in the School of Early Childhood Studies at Toronto Metropolitan University, and an adjunct member to the graduate program in Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies at York University. Her research and teaching focuses on race in early childhood settings, theoretical frameworks, in particular, critical race theory and feminist theories, and critical qualitative methods. Her research has appeared in the International Critical Childhood Policy Studies Journal, the Journal of Childhood Studies, Children and Society, and the International Journal of Qualitative Method, amongst others. In this presentation today, Dr. Berman will discuss the SSHRC-funded study, Can We Talk About Race? Confronting Colorblindness in Early Childhood Settings. This took place from 2014 to 2016 in Toronto. The project utilized critical race theory and the sociology of childhood and included interviews and the participant observation with children to explore the children's perceptions of race and racial identity. Some of the data generated, along with ethical dilemmas, issues of power, and questions that arose both during and after conducting this research, will be discussed. Please enjoy.
Thank you, Madison, for that introduction, and thank you to the cluster of the Sociology of Childhood and Youth, and thank you to the CSA. I am going to be sharing my screen, hopefully successfully. So I'm hoping if there's any issues, the panelists would let me know. So will slides be shared with attendees? Okay, so I'm not going to answer the questions. One of the moderators is going to keep track of the questions and is going to respond at the end, but we will be likely posting the presentation on YouTube. Thank you for being here today. What I'm going to be talking about is the Can We Talk About Race project, talking a little bit about the research team, the theoretical frameworks used in the project, some of the research questions we examined, the data gathering process, and some of the findings, and mostly the thread that runs through the presentation is behind the scenes decision making, unpacking some of the processes that went on, and reflecting on the process of doing this project. So as Madison noted, the project that I'll be talking about is the Can We Talk About Race? Confronting Color Blindness in Early Childhood Settings. And this was a project that ran from 2014 to 2016 and was a qualitative project based in Toronto, funded by SSHRC. And as well, it involved quite a number of pieces. What I'm talking about today will be the interviews with 21 children, ages 2 to 5 years, who attended one particular childcare setting. So we did conduct interviews with 18 professionals of field of early childhood at a variety of sites. We did some content analysis of 12 policy and curriculum documents. We did 14 participant observations with children in a combined preschool kindergarten class. And we have published on all this data. What we haven't really published on yet is the interviews. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So the research team is made up of a number of people, including myself, Dr. Alana Butler from Queen's University, and Dr. Beverly Jean Daniel from Toronto Met. And we also had 3 research assistants, Maggie McNevin, an MA in the Early Childhood Studies program and a registered early childhood educator, Rubina Quadri, who has a BA and was also a student in the MA program, and again, a registered early childhood educator, and Natalie Royer, who was a graduate of the MA program and again, a registered early childhood educator. So we employed the frameworks of critical race theory, colorblind racism, post-structuralism, and the sociology of childhood to examine the following research questions. And it might seem like we used quite a number of theories, which I think once we go through some of the project, you'll hopefully agree that we needed to. So we looked at the following research questions in this study. What strategies or materials do early childhood educators use to discuss or not discuss race with children? What discourses about race and racial identities are employed by children, by early childhood educators? How does race factor into children's play? How is race positioned in Ontario policy and curriculum documents? Who benefits from the use of certain discourses and who is disadvantaged? And we sought to make recommendations, recommendations for curriculum, for practice, for policy by using the findings from this study. And it's worth noting at this point that most researchers who study race in Canada are predominantly cognitive, race and children, I should say, are predominantly cognitive developmental psychologists, social psychologists, and they're typically looking at racial attitudes, prejudice, preferences, identification, awareness, and the theoretical frameworks that are used to understand and conceptualize children and race are rooted in the field of psychology. So we align ourselves with critical researchers who want to study children and race, not to measure, supposedly scientifically measure racial attitudes, but rather we want to explore children's lived experience with race and by extension, racial discourses. So for today's talk, the focus is going to be on the research question, what discourses about race and racial identities are employed by children? The participant observation has been analyzed and published But as I mentioned, the interview data with children hasn't really been explored as fully as we have some of the other pieces of the project. So for those of you from the Childhood and Youth Research Cluster of the CSA, you're probably quite familiar with the sociology of childhood. For those of you who are outside the cluster, perhaps this isn't an orientation or a paradigm you're familiar with, but maybe it is. Generally speaking, the dominant approach in sociological research in this country remains research on rather than with children. And this is the case for many reasons, including what research gets funded and what research gets approved by REBs. And REBs are also impacted by and participate in the perpetuation of prevailing cultural norms about children and childhood. For instance, children are innocent, children must be protected at all costs, and we can't dare, broach such topics with children. Sociologists who take up the sociology of childhood approach want to know what children can tell us about their lives, and they see children as competent and capable and able to share their views with researchers. Another position we took up in the project, and which is we were helped to reach this conclusion that children are not colorblind based on the research, the fact that infants react to racial differences as young as 6 months of age, that children show awareness of the concept of race as early age age 2 or 3. They develop racial and ethnic identity at a very young age. So this is research that has been carried out by psychologists. We also know that children make decisions on who to play with, who to interact with, based on race. This is not in every case, of course, but it's certainly something that occurs. And so the project is also undergirded by Bonilla Silva's 2009 theory of colorblind racism. So those of you who aren't familiar with colorblind racism theory, the theory captures the idea that racial inequality exists simultaneously in a world that holds on to the idea that race and racism is no longer relevant. So the Canadian mythos, of course, is that racism doesn't exist in Canada. And the dominant discourse is that Canada is a tolerant society. We're not like our neighbors to the south. Stewart, however, describes colorblindness as the Canadian condition. The project also took up ideas from critical race theory, which, if you hadn't heard of critical race theory before, I'm sure for all kinds of unfortunate reasons, you may be familiar with CRT now. Because there are many school boards in the United States banning CRT because the idea is that it's being taught to children and it's divisive and problematic. But it was really Trump and his cronies who started the charge to ban CRT. So those of you who aren't familiar with the tenets of CRT, it takes the position that race is a significant factor of social inequity. And by employing this premise, CRT allows researchers to examine racial assumptions that infiltrate our daily lives and can help others to understand these connections. So race, of course, in this theory is considered to be a social construct, and this is often signified by putting the word race in single quotes. According to CRT, acts of race hatred need not be obvious, right? They need not be blatant acts of racism. CRT takes the position that acts of racism can occur every day in a myriad of ways, and that such acts aren't unusual. In fact, they are the norm. In the context of childhood, racist acts may take the form of more subtle microaggressions that exist in policies. For example, attempts to control children's appearance, their hair, the curriculum, classroom interactions. and assumptions about children's ability, and then amongst children, their choices of whom to play with and how to play. So these are the various theories undergirding our approach, and we developed the project with the knowledge that children are seldom given space and opportunities to talk about race. So the team got together and we started to discuss, how are we going to generate data with children? How are we, what should we do? What do we put in the grant that went to SSHRC, and what's feasible and what are we going to do? So we started to have some discussions. Okay, we were going to do some participant observations, which I mentioned, get into children's play, have some discussions with children. And then we thought, what else? Well, we'll hold focus groups with children. And we thought we'd read a book to a small group of children and discuss the book. So then we got together, and the RAs went to various public libraries, and we collected all kinds of books that had to do with children and race. And we brought them all to a big table and started reading them and looking at them and talking about them. And one of the books that, if you look on the internet, that's suggested all the time is The Colors of Us by Karen Katz, written in 1999. And I thought, okay, this looks good. Maybe this is a good one. And the book starts by saying, my name is Lena and I am 7. I am the color of cinnamon. Mom says she could eat me up. So the other researchers on the project who identify as Black women quickly said this was totally not appropriate, that they didn't appreciate skin color being equated with food. And certainly there are a lot of critiques out there that foods being used to describe Black and brown skin are all often associated with colonialism, slavery, oppression, for example, chocolate, coffee, tea, and so on. So that book was out of the running. Then we looked at another book, which again, if you look on the web, pretty popular, Let's Talk About Race by Julius Lester. And at the very top of the book, which you probably cannot read, it says, I'll take off my race. Will you take off yours? So quickly, it was obvious that we're not going to use this book because it's really taking up a colorblind approach, and plus other critiques. So you might think, okay, well, what's the problem? There's got to be lots of books that you could read to children to get the conversation about race started. Unfortunately, when we were doing this project and looking at these books in 2014, actually, there weren't really a lot of books that we could use. And this is an infographic from the Cooperative Children's Book Center, the School of Education, University of Wisconsin-Madison, who keeps track of stats, what they call diversity in children's books. They released another infographic in 2018. But this was around the time we were looking for books. So you can see that representation in children's books of non-white children is abysmal. And it's pretty much the same. I know, so 0.9% of American Indians, First Nations. I believe now in 2022, it's about 2%. But certainly most children depicted in books are white. In fact, there's books with more animals and trucks than children who come from a variety of racialized groups. So some of you who are on Twitter might have seen the hashtags, We Need Diverse Books. Also, who gets to write about these experiences or tell these stories? And then there were also hashtags about own voices. Who are the authors getting published telling these stories? And there were op-eds in the New York Times, I think in 2016 about this. So this, it's an ongoing issue around children's literature and who gets to be the main character. And if a child of color is in the book, are they just a sidekick? Like, how are they represented? So it quickly became apparent that using a book to talk to children about race wasn't as straightforward as we thought. So then we thought, okay, given this situation, maybe what we'll do is approach this in another way. So we decided that we would, sorry, I'm moving my little picture around here, that we would build on some work done by McNaughton and Davis in Australia. And what they had done after we received consent from parents and asked children for assent, that we would ask children to draw a self-portrait and then draw a portrait of a friend in the classroom. So this was what McNaughton and Davis had done. So we thought, okay, self-portraiture, drawing a picture of a friend, this sounds pretty reasonable. We'll try that. So we provided paper with various shades, markers, and a mirror. And we used some of the questions they came up with, and we developed some of our own. So the idea was that the 3 research assistants hired for the project, who were very familiar with working with children, that they would be the people doing the interviews. And so the goal was to have people working with children in this context who, again, as I said, were familiar with interacting with children. So we thought that was fairly straightforward. It wasn't so straightforward. Could you please draw a picture of yourself? Which of the colors in the picture is your favorite color? So if we suggested, if they haven't started drawing, ask if they have a favorite color. What color are your eyes? Can you show the marker you think looks most like your eye color? Please tell me, what color is your hair? Can you show me the marker you think looks most like your hair color? What color are your lips? What color is your nose? What color is your skin? Can you show the marker that looks most like your skin color? What do you think of your skin? What does it remind you of? Or what do you think about? Do you like the color of the skin you have? If yes, what do you like about your skin? If no, what is it you don't like about your skin? Is there a color of skin you'd like to have? Can you show the marker that looks most like the skin color you'd like to have? So these were the questions that were taken into the center. Can you show, and the last probe was, can you show me which of the markers is a skin color you like the least? So we ordered what you can see, if you can read at the very bottom of this photo, what are called multicultural, and at the top too, multicultural colors. So yes, Crayola since the early 90s has made something called multicultural crayons or markers. And some of you might be quite familiar with these. So we wanted children to have the option of finding tones that they felt matched their skin color. So it's a whole other project about the problematic nature of having multicultural colors. But what we're going to talk about right now is the fact that we weren't setting out to analyze the children's drawings. What we wanted to do is use drawing as a method to facilitate the conversation. So an arts-based method to, as I said, to facilitate. And there's been a lot written about arts-based methods used with children. There's been pieces written on, do you need to use different methods with children than you do with adults? So this is discussed in the Lit, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Most of the children were quite attracted by the new good markers, which is a rare treat in a busy childcare setting, and the stand-up mirror. And many seemed to genuinely enjoy working on their drawings, talking to the interviewer. But a few seemed a bit anxious about having to draw. For example, one participant seemed disappointed in his drawing and said in a sad tone of voice, "I can't make a circle." Another hesitated before his drawing and asked, "How do you draw my friends?" And although we clearly told the children they didn't have to participate in the project, and the RAs were very vigilant about verbal and nonverbal signs that the children didn't want to continue the interview, we really, as a team, as a project, failed to explicitly provide them with the option to participate without drawing. So rethinking this part of the project, offering choices to children regarding how they participate really respects them as complex individuals, and relying on broad assumptions like all children like to draw can create some uncomfortable experiences for some participants. So as noted, although some children found the drawing activity not something they wanted to participate in, or it created some difficulties for them, interesting data did arise as many children completed the drawings. For example, we found that some white children chose a light beige marker to draw their skin, but didn't know what to call the color. Others identified their skin as white and then felt some confusion over a lack of white marker. So race, you can, these children aren't necessarily talking about race. And as has been published elsewhere, we were told by the educators in this environment that children didn't pay attention to race, and they didn't know anything about it. That's not what we found out. So in an interview with a biracial child who was Black and white, and parents identified the children's race and ethnicity, we heard the following. So the interview asked, this is an excerpt from one of the interviews, "Which one don't you like? What skin color don't you like? Not this, not this, not this, not this. Which one is this that you don't like? I don't like this one." Points to black marker. What color is that? Do you know? Black. So I don't like this one. So unfortunately, we hadn't spent enough time talking about what do you say next? How could you probe? What could you ask this child about why they're expressing what they're expressing? But we heard from a biracial participant, Chinese and white male, who's 2.5 years old. So this child responded when asked, "Is there a marker in the basket you think looks like your eye color?" So they are described as rummaging in the basket and choosing a brown marker. "Oh, that would be a good one. You could draw your eyes with that color," says said the researcher. "Brown, brown. What about your hair? What color is your hair?" "Brown too." "It is brown. Which marker do you think matches your hair the most?" Hold up the purple marker. "Do you want to look in the basket again?" "Yeah." "Which color looks like your face, like your skin?" Let's draw purple." "You want to use some purple?" "Yeah." "Is that the color of skin you'd like to have?" "Yes." "What color?" Blue." "You'd like to have blue skin?" Yeah, because the brown is blue." So it might seem that some of this is nonsensical, but these actions can be interpreted in a few ways. So Dockett and Perry, who are researchers who have done a lot of research with children in school setting, argue that sometimes children might use actions like this to exercise control over their level of participation. Perhaps the children felt in some way compelled to participate in the study, And they wanted to draw things other than what was requested as an act of resistance. So here's an example of that. What do you like about your skin? Can I make an animal? An animal on your picture? Yeah. So we heard a couple of responses like this from children. And so what we do argue is that drawing yourself and a friend should have been fairly easily understood by most of the participants. So it's possible their resistance was intended to signal they didn't want to draw what was asked and they didn't want to engage in this conversation. One of the RAs noted that during these moments, she felt a bit of frustration by what she felt at the time was non-participation. And, you know, reflecting back on it, felt that her desire to get quote unquote good data might have caused her to miss some opportunities to really hear what the participants were saying, verbally and non-verbally, and to engage and respond. So that's certainly a learning, a takeaway from our interviews with the children. So, as mentioned, the goal that I'm talking about today is talking to the children and hearing what they had to say. And we really thought, you know, we're going to have RAs in the project who have worked with children, who are experienced working with children, and that this background would help to make things go more smoothly. For those of you who are steeped in this area of participatory research with children, you, I'm sure, are aware that a lot of attention has been paid in the literature about the role of the adult researcher. So different positions have been, subject positions have been recommended. For example, what's called the least adult role. So you're going to act not like an adult, you're going to act like a kid as best as you can, whatever that means, crawling around on the floor when children are building their blocks. So this has been critiqued as not really something that children would take seriously. I mean, you're an adult, they know you're an adult. Sometimes children have positioned adult researchers going into some settings as a strange adult, because you're an adult, but you're talking to the kids in a way that most adults in certain settings, particularly school settings, don't. For those of you familiar with William Corsero's research, his ethnography, the kids decided in the end to call him Big Bill. So they positioned him and gave him a name. So, and in qualitative research, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the insider-outsider discussions around who, you know, are you a member of the group you're studying? Are you outside that group? So Thorne, in her seminal work of Gender and Play, talks about how she could relate more to the girls in her study because she identifies as a woman and she could relate more to their play. So gender came in as a factor. Paul Connolly, in his work with South Asian children, girls, I should say, in the UK, talks about being a male researcher and an adult interviewing children and how that might play out in his research. But rarely do characteristics of the researcher get thought about other than age or gender. So race doesn't really play a factor. Our project included researchers and RAs who were racialized in a number, or rather a variety of ways. And we did find out, looking at the preliminary analysis of some of this data, that children as young as 2.5 years old were aware of the similarities and differences. I'm trying to move this cursor, but it doesn't want to move. That's okay. The cursor is The cursor is resisting my presentation. Okay, we're going to play from the current slide. And so we found out that the children were as young as 2.5 were aware of similarities and differences between their own and the interviewer's skin colors. For example, a participant who was 2.5 years old in South Asian began to draw a picture of the white interviewer. So this is an example of a child, deciding that's what they were going to draw, and rejected the brown paper he had used for his own self-portrait, stating this is too dark. So they oriented to the white interviewer's skin color and made a decision about what they were drawing. A 4-year-old white child being interviewed by that same researcher identified his skin color as white, like yours. When later asked in the interview if there were any skin colors he would not like to have, the same participant can be seen orienting to the interviewer once again and marking them both as a certain type of insider. Maybe all of the other skin colors than white, and there would just be white skinned people like you and me. I think maybe I just want white and tan. So here might have been an opportunity to have a discussion with this child about why they thought this and what that meant. But we didn't do that. So before closing, I wanted to just touch on one ethical issue. Many came up, as you can see, but I think it's very important when you're conducting research with children around who owns the data. So when it comes to research with children, Thomas and O'Kane pointed out a number of years ago that confidentiality is complicated by the fact that adults may expect to be told about the private lives or thoughts of children for whom they are responsible. And indeed, we did get a request from a parent when we were seeking consent. She wanted to see and have the transcript. She wanted to have a copy of the audio tape. And in the research literature on participatory research with children, some researchers think this is fine and hand it over. Others argue that it's a wonderful memento for a child to have when they're older. So they give it to the parents because the parents can pass it on to the child and so forth. Other researchers caution that this isn't fair to the children who are participating and who haven't agreed to have their ideas passed on to somebody else. Sometimes teachers want access as well. So we wrote a note to the parent who had requested this and put it in the child's cubby and kind of explained that while the amalgamated data would be readily available, that we wouldn't be sharing individual transcripts or audio tapes of children's interviews, and that parent declined to have their child involved in the research. So just again, this is something to contemplate and really think about when you're conducting research with children, that you go in with a clear idea of who owns the data. And again, it comes back to your conceptualizations of children. So next steps, we hope to really analyze the transcripts and the field notes of the interviewers that I was making reference to today. And we need to think about the interview context more deeply. The importance of the interviewer. Does the child orient to the race of the interviewer before, during the interview? If so, how? I think that's something that we need to think about and analyze more carefully. And I would invite other researchers conducting research with children, because it's certainly, this has been considered with research with adults, but I haven't really seen it in when conducting research with children. So some key publications that have come out of the project include a publication where we talked with the ECEs, which is entitled Nothing or Almost Nothing to Report, Early Childhood Educators, Discursive Constructions of Color Blindness. We most recently gave a number of sessions free to a few hundred early childhood educators in the province, because one of the things we learned in our project is that early childhood educators had not been exposed to anti-racist curriculum or practice. They really didn't know how to talk about race with children or racist incidents. So we held a knowledge sharing initiative, and we've written about that. And if you're interested in learning more about the participatory observations, that research has been analyzed and written up in a publication called The Black Baby Doll Doesn't Fit: The Disconnect Between Early Childhood Diversity Policy, Early Childhood Educator Practice, and Children's Play. So thank you for listening to me muse about our work, and I hope that you found it helpful and interesting. And I really welcome any questions or comments that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was fantastic. I'm just going to take a moment to congratulate you. Hello, everybody. My name is Noah Keneally, and I am going to be facilitating the Q&A portion of our fantastic webinar. Rachel, really, thank you so much. What an honor it is to have you present today with us, and such fascinating work too. Really, really appreciate it. So I'm going to invite attendees to drop questions that they might have into the chat, and we'll be moderating that. But maybe just while we're getting things started, Rachel, I have a zillion questions, of course, but I'd love to, oh, and I just noticed that you're muted. I don't know if you mean to be muted, but you're muted there. So fantastic, great. So I just find this topic so fascinating, and the work so courageous and important. And I had a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about, and if you wouldn't mind talking about while we wait for other folks to come up with questions. So you were talking about extraneous responses in terms of maybe kids approaching the research encounter or the research activities with some other ideas of their own. And that maybe having questions around how that might or might not be considered non-participation, right? I think it's an interesting thing for us to think about. Children might not know us, and so in terms of developing a research relationship with them, they might not feel ready yet to engage in that kind of like digging into things and exploring those ideas. But could you talk about some things that maybe you've thought of in terms of suggestions to work with extraneous responses like that have sort of emerged from this project?
Well, first I'd say that you're absolutely right about building rapport, which, is discussed in the research with children, and something the research assistants did do, and I didn't mention, was go into these settings a few times and read a story, play with the children. So they were at least a familiar face when they came in to ask the children to draw. But yeah, so I think that's really important to have some kind of familiarity. As far as extraneous pieces, I think, it depends. I think probing further is key. So, somebody who wants to draw an animal, or we had somebody who wanted to draw a superhero. So, to be comfortable enough to maybe still see what you could do with that. So what color is your superhero? Or do animals have skin colors? So I think it's comfort level, it's practice, all those things. And I think experience. So one suggestion might be to probe that a little bit and see where it can go, but at the same time, to be respectful if the child is saying, I don't want to talk about this with you right now, to respect that.
Yeah.
That's one thought.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. What a good, thoughtful response. So there are a couple of, I'll just take a moment to take a look in the chat. Someone's very inspired by how you did research with students and such young students too. And how you used arts-based research as an entry point into as a means into the conversation. That's not so much of a question. That's good, but the very, wonderful compliment and comment. And then I think someone's asking about citations.
Right.
So maybe we could provide some citations with, maybe we'll follow up on the research cluster Twitter, and on the website, and we can put those citations up there. That'd be useful.
That's great. And Sherry, I just noticed Noah in the chat.
Fantastic. That's right. Yeah, is able to link to articles. Fantastic.
So I will, and a couple of them are fortunately open access. Hooray. One of them is behind a paywall, so you'd have to be able to access it through a university library. But yeah, there's a bunch that I'm more than happy to make available, and Sherry can share, and I'm thrilled that you want to read them. So that's great.
Fantastic. Thanks, folks, for listing your questions. I see that there's more and more here. Really appreciate it. So a question here, Rachel, do you think that doing the interviews in a different space or place would be beneficial? I think that the interviews might have been in the early childhood classroom, and I'm interested in how the other children in the class or other educators might impact the child's participation. Yeah,
great question. Thank you, Laurel. Nice to see you here. Well, or at least see your words here. Yeah, I think the childcare setting that we used had a little room attached to the childcare, but it was kind of off to the side. But yeah, I think it's, this is something to think about, that other children may wander over and ask what's going on. The educators too, although we had a meeting and we introduced the project, something that happened once when one of the RAs showed up, they were introduced as the teacher to the children. So then we thought, okay, so we really need to work on, who is this coming in? It's a researcher. What is a researcher? So I think you're absolutely right that these are all things, sometimes children perhaps, it's been talked about in the research that they feel compelled to participate because it's a school setting. So pros and cons for sure. I mean, research that's done in children's homes, there's pros and cons of that too. With parents, answering for children or directing conversation. So yeah, I think whatever setting you use, you need to be aware of these issues, and work with them the best you can. You're not going to have any perfect, clean setting. So yeah, again, I think that's also perhaps comfort level and experience. But yeah, every setting has its drawbacks and its advantages. And it also depends, I think, because the setting too, there's gatekeepers involved. So are the teachers enthusiastic about this project? Are they, do they, how do they feel about it? And yeah, so the adults in the setting also play a role as well as other children. There is some literature on this that's probably worth taking a look at.
Thanks for that, Rachel. And my apologies, I couldn't see who was posting the questions, but I've reorganized things now. And so I just want to thank Stephanie and Jessica and Laurel myself. Thank you so much for posing these questions. And we have another question from Stephen. So Stephen says, in your analysis, did you apply a critical stance to critical theory in order to consider that perhaps the children weren't connecting markers or that even the skin colors to race, and that preferences were maybe connected more to liking their own or a friend's look to other looks? Stephen goes on to say, in other words, are the researchers aware of their own theoretical biases in terms of making sense of children's words and behaviors? There's another question too, but I'll just ask you to address those.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, there's different lenses you can put on the interpretation. There's a lot of research that talks about the fact that children do orient to race, in the sense that they do make decisions about who to play with and who not to play with. They do make decisions around race. So, yeah, I mean, how do we define race? What is race? I don't think they necessarily, have the depth of information that we do about racial inequality, but children can certainly understand fairness and what's fair, what's unfair. They can also understand, they see how their parents are treated in certain, in stores or on the bus or the subway. Like they don't live in this world where race doesn't exist. And I think that's particularly true of Black and brown children. So, and who have families who are more likely to talk to them about their race, because they will tell them things like the fact that they, can't play in certain ways, perhaps. We do know that teachers make decisions about how children should be disciplined based on their race. So there's studies about Black children acting a certain way, particularly boys, and white boys acting a certain way, very young children, and they're disciplined differently. So children see this kind of thing in their environment. They might not be able to put a name to it, but they see this difference. So, yeah, do you think we're saying our theoretical bias? Yeah, we brought a CRT lens to the research. We absolutely did. We went in with that lens, so you can interpret the words and behavior in using another theoretical lens. This is the lens we were taking up, and I don't think we were, we're not putting words in their mouth when they're saying things like, I like white skin like you. And what does that mean? That's where we dropped the ball perhaps a little bit, because we needed to probe. Okay, so why do you want to have white skin? Why do you only like white and tan skin? Why do you feel that way? Why, like that's where we needed to go a little further. And redirecting this discussion back to skin color, we were following the questions and of the interview. And when children said things like, I want blue, we didn't say like, you must tell us about what's your skin. There are no blue skin colors. Like I would say we probably could have probed more, and that was what we fell down on. But yeah, the idea that I think reading these transcripts in conjunction with the participant observations of children's play would help elucidate the fact that, yeah, they were in some cases talking about skin color, in other cases they weren't orienting to skin color. But yeah, in the play observations, we certainly saw the way that materials were played with was problematic. And we often think of children's play being innocent and good, and play is, but it takes up the discourses that children are surrounded with. So that's my long-winded answer. Yeah, sure, it's possible.
I think you really did all of those questions justice. Thanks, Rachel, so much. Guadalupe asks, how can you explain to educators that children do know about race?
Well, I think there is a lot more work being done recently, particularly sadly in a post-George Floyd world. More people are interested in this question. This is exactly what we did last summer. We got a connections grant from SSHRC, and we hosted 4 sessions where we talked to educators about the research about children, and decisions children make, and the ideas children have, and what they express, and how things get played out in certain settings. So there's a lot of research that argues and demonstrates that children are quite aware of racial differences. I mean, the idea that, you know, children don't notice these things is kind of absurd. And so they do notice, and then what meaning do they put on it? That's like saying, you know, children don't know about, you know, gender. Yeah, we'd never say that.
Yeah.
But somehow we say that children don't know about race. And again, going back to colorblind theory, is because I think there's a liberal idea too that talking about race is somehow racist. So we don't want to talk about it, and we don't want to put ideas into children's heads, but they are forming ideas. And so if we don't have discussions, where does that leave us as far as a society? I think we need to be having these discussions, and educators need to be aware of their biases.
Yeah.
That's my soapbox, but
great. And their responsibilities, I think, too, right? So unfortunately, we have just 3 minutes left. So I'm just going to take one more question here. Okay, so I think you addressed, Jessica asked about ethnographic observation in the classroom, and I think you addressed that during the presentation.
yeah, if I could, I'm just going to go. So how colorblind ideology operated for children. So yeah, the ethnographic observation, and thank you, Sarah. And then Stephen is saying, let's hear how the children's play was problematic. It wasn't part of your presentation. No, it wasn't, but it's published, and you're welcome to read the publications. I made mention of it very quickly at the end of the presentation. It's called The Black Baby Doll Doesn't Fit. It was published about 5 years ago in Early Child Development and Care, and I'm hoping that Sherry will be sharing the link to that presentation. So yeah, it wasn't the focus of today's presentation because it's been published and it's accessible. So you're welcome to track that down. And do we know that children that age do know about gender in the way it is understood by critical theory? I'm not sure that's an established fact. I'm sorry, I don't really understand what you're asking. Children know. There's a lot of research on especially perhaps non-binary children who are quite aware about ideas about gender. Quite aware. Children make decisions like, I'm not going to play with you, you're a boy, or only girls allowed. Yeah, they know about gender. So maybe not in the way we might perhaps talk about gender as a room of sociologists. Yeah, okay. My presentation wasn't about gender or sex, so you're welcome to check some of the research that is widely available on that topic. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to, we have 1 minute left, so I'm just gonna really, Rachel, thank you so much for doing this presentation. It was really illuminating and on such an important topic. And I also want to thank everybody who came, and what a fun thing for our research cluster to do. I'm going to invite you folks to look at the CSA website and find our website there. Yeah, here's some information. Yes. So thank you all so much for attending. Rachel, again, thank you so much. Just a huge round of applause for this wonderful presentation.
Yes, and thank you for your work on the childhood and youth research cluster. So much appreciated that you're working hard to get that research out there.
I mean, if it's of this caliber, I'm going to speak for all of us. It's our pleasure. Wonderful.